Hi, I'm Joe Stark, creator of the fantasy adventure series The Unscarred. If you like what you hear today, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Now, on to the show.
On the world of Faereyas, a god made flesh is born every 500 years. These beings are known as the Chosen, but the world will come to call one of them the Unscarred. The Unscarred, written by Joe Stark.
Chapter 5 The Battle. Trumpets and drums greeted the sun as it began to illuminate the eastern sky. A small army was arrayed before the edge of the great forest. The smoking remains of a sacked village could be seen in the distance. Along the horizon, several other pillars of smoke could be seen, testament to the army's destructive path. The Ka had chosen their defensive position well. The floor of the steppe before them was a natural funnel sweeping away from the forest's edge. Large escarpments of bedrock jutted from the ground to the north and to the south, negating the possibility of attack from horseback. At the mouth of the funnel, the Ka had erected wooden defenses, hewn logs lashed together with hemp rope fashioned into large X's. From each placement hung an upside-down Farron, captured soldiers from the Pirate King's army. Many hung limp from their bonds, their heads purple and swollen from the long hours of inversion. Galen, Hoke, and Eric huddled beneath the cover of the leafy canopy, spying their enemy's position. "I see heavy cavalry and mounted archers," said Hoke. "All horsemen, not an infantryman to be found. It appears they've come for a campaign of shock and awe. I dare say they won't enter the forest. Not with these troops." "Stalemate," said Eric. "The Pirate King's forces will not enter the forest, and the Ka will not engage them on the plains." Galen nodded in agreement. "We nettle them with nightly raids and guerrilla tactics, but we cannot stand against them upon the open steppe. Our warriors are bold, but we are not a suicidal people." Galen then fixed Eric with a knowing stare. "Your moment is upon you now, Unscarred. The time has come to step forward from this forest and walk the footpath of fate." A single trumpet blast sounded from the besieging army. The lines parted to allow a pair of riders to emerge. They both rode magnificent white horses. One was dressed in full armor. A plume of colored feathers rising from his helm marked him to be a general. The other wore a black robe, concealing his features, yet standing in stark contrast to the brilliant white of the horse. The armored man removed his helm. "I am Lord Keller Tallis, High General of the Army of Kartu. Hear this, you Ka savages. These highland plains are hereby reclaimed in the name of King Zarin Zaris. Any incursion onto our sovereign lands will be dealt with harshly." As the general continued to speak, Eric felt his blood begin to boil. A burning desire to kill raged within his chest like a beast roaring to be let loose. This man had set an army of butchers loose upon peaceful villages. They had slaughtered indiscriminately women and children, the young and the old. All fell to the butchers of Zarin Zaris, and this Lord Keller Tallis now had the audacity to call the Ka savages? Eric made to take a step forward, but was stopped by Hoke. "You would charge headlong into this army with a fucking stick?" said Hoke, motioning to Eric's staff. "I've seen you do incredible things, Eric, but this is madness," the Farron hissed. As Eric considered Hoke's words, he remembered a book he'd read during his time upon the Isle of Divinity. In the time of Alana, the fallen chosen had been known for her skill as a warrior. She had fought many battles in the Great Southern Wars, when previously unknown Faeryn tribes from the southern continent had waged war upon their northern neighbors. The wars dragged on for centuries before the lands separating the continents were blighted and turned to inhospitable deserts and canyon lands, effectively creating a maze within a barren wasteland. The stories were colorful in nature and clearly meant to embellish and impress. Eric remembered a sketch included amongst the flowing script. It depicted Alanna standing victorious in a sea of vanquished foes, a great sword held high overhead. The blade was long as Alanna was tall, thin and slightly curved with a single edge and slanted tip. Eric held the picture firm in his mind as he gripped the end of his stonewood staff with both hands. Parting his fists, he pulled forth a long blade of darkened steel, manifesting the sword by will alone. Hoke's eyes widened. "Fuck me," he whispered incredulously as the young chosen turned and strode through the tree line. Stepping into the open, Eric held his sword high. "Enough," he shouted. "Let us end this now, Lord Talus. I challenge you." Eric was suddenly knocked down by 3 arrows striking his chest. Talus chuckled from atop his horse. Challenge accepted. Gasps issued from both the tree line and the army ranks as Eric stood. Gritting his teeth, he tore the arrows from his chest and tossed them aside. "You haven't enough arrows among your army to stop me," shouted Eric. A dozen mounted archers stood in their stirrups and began raining arrows upon the young chosen. Eric suddenly burst forward into a quick sprint. Swinging his sword, he cut down the incoming arrows before they could find their mark. With a motion from the general, his entire regiment of archers fired upon Eric. Eric skidded to a stop as the sky darkened from the incoming projectiles. He furiously slashed with his sword, but the barrage was too much. Eric fell back under the onslaught. He raised his arms to cover his face, but noticed a thing as he fell. No arrows had found their mark. Instead, they had harmlessly impacted the ground around him. Again, the sky darkened with the promise of incoming death. Eric climbed to his feet and stood defiant, his arms upraised as the arrows closed the distance. He breathed evenly and calmed his mind as he prepared to make his move. Eric quickly pulled his outstretched arms back as though he were tugging aside a great weight. The cloud of incoming arrows suddenly parted, the projectiles thudding harmlessly into the ground around the young chosen. Eric raised his sword as another volley of arrows was launched. His eyes narrowed as he measured their approach. "Upon you, dogs!" he shouted in Ka as he pointed with his sword. The arrows suddenly changed course, arcing backward high overhead and raining death upon the besieging army. Chaos erupted as soldiers broke lines to avoid the onslaught. Horses ran rampant as they were struck, trampling men as they attempted to take cover. Eric looked at the forest of arrows protruding from the ground around him. He swung his sword upward and shouted, "Return!" The arrows tore loose from the soil in a great burst, pelting Eric with dirt and sod as the projectiles raced back through the sky, seeking their source. Eric again charged the army, his sword trailing behind him as he ran. Quickly closing the distance, he leapt and cut down a man on horseback. With a great roar, the Ka rushed from the forest and joined the fray. Hawk watched through Hoke's eyes with rapt attention as her brother raced into the chaotic mass of churning steel. Due to the nature of their magical bond, she had witnessed firsthand many of his previous fights, but nothing had prepared her for the horror of battle. The air was full of death as men and horses screamed in agony. The wounded and terrified mounts wreaked havoc as they trampled and tore through Zaren's forces. The scene rapidly shifted as Hoke's eyes darted back and forth. A man wearing the red tunic of Zaren's army rushed into their shared field of vision. Hoke lashed out with a precise strike, his sword's point easily finding a weak spot in the man's armor. Hoke barely gave the man a second glance as he stepped over his corpse. Hawk strained to see beyond the mass of combatants. She knew Eric was somewhere ahead of them, but she couldn't catch sight of him. As Hoke continued to fight his way through the melee, Hawk turned her mind to Eric. The young man was a fascinating enigma. The young chosen, she corrected herself in near disbelief. As enigmatic as he was, Hawk believed his claim as the seventh chosen. The feats she'd witnessed confounded her senses. Magic required study and patience, planning and forethought. One didn't manifest energies by thought alone, yet Eric's powers worked without incantation or hand sign, no words of power or devices of arcane nature to employ his intent. He simply willed the spells into existence. Again, Hawk strained to catch view of Eric, but try as she might, she couldn't see beyond the mass of fighters around Hoke. I need a better vantage point, she thought to herself. Hawk shot skyward as her astral form disconnected from Hoke's psyche. Hovering high above the field of battle, Hawk reeled for a moment before regaining her composure. She'd been astral projecting herself since childhood, but using magic through Hoke's body was an arduous endeavor. Hawk looked downward over the raging battle. The Kaw advance had washed forward from the forest like a tsunami of blood and death. Zaren's army, so formidable when facing an adversary in the field, found themselves being slaughtered like sheep among a pack of starving wolves. Hawk's eyes followed a wide swath of red-stained grasses thick with the bodies of men and horses. She felt revulsion rise from deep within as she surveyed the carnage, but still she pressed onward. At the bleeding edge of the trail of death, she found Eric. The young chosen was moving with a speed that defied the eye. Hawk strained to fix her gaze upon Eric as he streaked through the enemy lines, bringing death to men before they could react to his presence. Hawk felt the chill of fear. Her life had been dedicated to the study of magic, but she had never seen such a display of raw and incredible power. She watched in horror as Eric slaughtered everything in his path. He'd become a raging whirlwind of death, seemingly incapable of being stopped. Hawk felt the familiar tingle of magic in the air as clouds began to gather. What is this now? She thought to herself. Hawk closed her eyes and whispered an incantation. Opening her eyes, she saw lines of force extending from the battlefield as wispy tendrils snaking into the sky, pulling at the gathering clouds like a great net. Hawk traced the lines of force back to their convergence. She expected they would lead back to Eric, but instead they led her to the black-robed man. No longer astride his white horse, the man stood within a circle of lancers, his arms outstretched to the heavens as he furiously mouthed incantations. "Gods above," thought Hawk in alarm. "Hoke," she shouted across their mental bridge. "The black-robed man with General Tallis. He's a fucking chaos mage!" A lightning bolt suddenly tore loose from the darkened sky, blinding Hawk's vision. Reacting by instinct, she returned to the room that bridged her and Hoke's shared psyches. Her vision swam as she attempted to regain her focus, but the strain of astral projecting herself from Hoke's body had left her drained. She slumped into her chair and closed her eyes, surrendering to the comforting darkness of sleep as it enveloped her exhausted mind. Eric's vision narrowed as he surveyed the soldiers arrayed before him. They seemed to slow in their movements as the roar of the battlefield dimmed into silence in Eric's ears until only the sound of his heartbeat remained. He swung his sword as he charged, leaving the grasses stained red with blood and gore in his wake. Still he charged forward, another heartbeat in his ear, another score of dead littering the ground. Nothing was left standing in his passage as he carved a path of destruction through the Pirate King's army. Eric allowed himself to fall into the flow of combat. His body moved like an automaton, muscles rapidly running through engrams ingrained through years of training. His body knew what to do, where to strike. Eric recognized that it was merely performing a task, rote and mundane, like the scything of wheat or the chopping of firewood, a chore in need of completion. Freed of duty, Eric felt his mind begin to drift. Thunder rumbled as the skies darkened overhead. Clouds roiled over black and heavy with moisture, churning with fury in their movements. A whisper began to form within the recesses of Eric's mind. He strained to discern their words. "For you are their judgment, their death," the voice whispered. Eric felt waves of righteous anger flow through his body as his sword slashed again and again. "You are their just reward, the darkness at their door," the voice continued, louder now. "You will show these devils the wrath of a god made flesh," the voice shouted within Eric's mind. A great bolt of lightning suddenly split the heavens with a resounding boom of thunder. Eric was thrown to the ground by the force of the strike. His vision swam and the metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. Eric spat as he shakily climbed to his feet. A cadre of knights were approaching Eric on foot. Their lances were leveled as they stalked forward. Eric's gaze was drawn past them to a man in black that trailed behind. His hands were raised high as he shouted, "I am Tovin, first acolyte of the Chaos Master Jaren Varric. I am your death." He dropped his upraised hands, calling down another bolt of lightning onto Eric. The young chosen was again knocked down by the force of the blast. Tovin continued to shout incantations as he called down bolt after bolt, leaving Eric dazed at the bottom of a smoking crater. General Tallis stepped forward into the encircling ring of knights. "Stop toying with him and finish this, Tovin," said Tallis. Tovin closed his eyes and began to mumble an incantation. Eric was suddenly engulfed in a pillar of fire. He opened his mouth to scream, but it was cut short as the heat of the flames sucked the air from his lungs. A vision flooded his mind as every pain receptor in his body cried in searing agony. He saw a tomb as the voice again spoke. "There sits Faldor, the last wizard king of the Ka, entombed within the lost city of Karas-In. He waits." Eric's grip tightened upon the hilt of his sword, his blackened skin cracking and oozing with the effort. He swept his sword in a circle around him, knocking aside the incoming lances from the surrounding knights. The vision disappeared, but the voice remained, urging him forward. Gritting his teeth, he took a step forward, climbing over the piles of broken earth, as Tovin redirected the spell into a blast of fire from his outstretched palms. Eric continued his steady progression forward, step after agonizing step. His skin flaked away as it turned to ash, exposing muscle tissue and bone, but still he pressed on. As he closed to within striking range, he raised his sword high. Tallis brought forth a small device from his belt pouch and began fumbling with its lever as Eric swung his sword in a vicious downward arc. Tallis and Tovin disappeared as Eric's sword cut a long furrow in the soil where they had stood just moments before. The long blade glistened red in the morning sunlight. Freed from the withering effects of the conjured fire, Eric dropped to his knees as he took in a ragged breath. The sounds of the battle were beginning to subside as the last of the Pirate King's army were overcome by the Ka warriors. "Eric?" asked a familiar voice. Eric wiped his face with his hands, the blackened skin and ash smeared aside to show unbroken skin beneath. He looked up to see Hoke standing before him. "Gods above," said Hoke. "You really are a chosen." "Unscarred," a nearby Ka called out, raising his sword. The call was quickly taken up and repeated, and soon Eric and Hoke found themselves consumed within the clamor of the cacophonous chant. Eric slowly stood and faced the crowd. He held his sword high as the Ka chanted, "Unscarred! Unscarred!" Hoke laughed as he tossed him a cloak. "Not to spoil your moment, mate, but for God's sake, cover your cock." Hundreds of miles to the south, in the palace of Kartu, King Zarin Zaris lounged on his golden throne as he listened to a petitioner beg for the help of his royal majesty. Zarin absent-mindedly toyed with a dagger as he considered plunging it into the petitioner's neck. How dare he bore his king with such mundane requests as food? A commotion broke out at the end of the hall as the lords Tallis and Tovin suddenly appeared in a burst of wind and fire. The smell of burning flesh swept through the room as the pair silently stood upon the patterned tile floor. "Lord Tallis," shouted Zarin as he stood before his throne, "how goes your campaign through the north?" All eyes were upon the pair as their bodies fell to the floor in a wash of blood. Both men had been cleanly cut in half. The room erupted into chaos as men and women of the court rushed to flee. Zarin gritted his teeth and turned to a black-robed man standing behind his throne. "Inform Lord Jaren at once. He will wish to deal with this himself." The robed man nodded and turned to leave. "My lord." Zarin held up his hand and motioned for silence. He settled back down onto his throne and thought for a moment. "Send a scouting party north. I would have the benefit of knowledge before committing more troops into the field." Zarin smiled to himself as he waved away the robed man. Setbacks like this were expected. He controlled the throne. Soon he would control the whole of Faereyas. The sound of footfalls echoed through the quiet corridor as a small party made their way through the labyrinth of torchlit passages beneath the palace of Kartu. Two of the party were dressed in the robes of acolytes, while the other pair wore the plain gray of servants. They stopped before a heavy wooden door. One of the acolytes, a young woman, stepped forward and knocked. The latch turned with a soft click, and the heavy door swung inward of its own accord. The female acolyte gave a brief nod to her peer, a man with a short beard, before ushering the servants through the open doorway. The room beyond was immense, Large stone pillars disappeared into the darkness that loomed above, beyond the reach of the flickering torchlight. A stone altar sat within a small circle of torches in the center of the room. Upon the altar rested the remains of General Talus and the acolyte Tovin. Their severed top and bottom halves lay twisted and grotesque. The servants gasped in terror at the grisly sight. The acolytes herded the frightened servants toward the altar. A figure garbed in black robes appeared from the darkness. He whispered incantations as he approached the servants. "Peace," he said quietly as he placed his hands upon their arms. The frightened men instantly became docile, their terror turning to calm. They stood quietly as if in a daze, awaiting further command from the man in black. The acolytes took a knee before their master and bowed their heads. "Master Varric," they intoned. Jaren Varric briefly surveyed his acolytes before turning his gaze upon the contents of the altar. General Talus had meant nothing to him, and the man's passing had been as such. But the loss of his acolyte Tovin weighed heavily upon the master Chaos Mage. The fool, Varric thought to himself. He felt not the loss of someone, but of something. Varric had spent years training his acolytes, sharpening them into powerful weapons of war. Years now wasted upon Tovin. "Rise, my children, and look upon the failure of your brother," said Varric. "I will not fail you, master," said the acolytes in unison. "We shall see," answered Varric in turn. "Let us begin." The acolytes took up places behind each of the servants and began to chant an incantation. Varric stood before the altar and spoke his own words of power. The chants echoed off the stone floors before disappearing into the surrounding darkness. As they continued, the incantations became frenzied. Varric shouted into the chaos as his acolytes produced knives from the folds of their robes. In tandem, they cut the throats of the servants still standing docile and dazed. Blood fountained from their wounds, spraying over the altar and the bodies of Talus and Tovin. Varric ran his fingers through the blood as it dripped from the altar. He traced a rune into Tovin's forehead and mumbled an incantation. "Show me, child. Show me your death," he whispered as he placed his palm over the bloody rune. Visions flooded through the Master Chaos Mage's mind as he witnessed the final moments of his acolyte's life. Varric paced for a moment in silence as he considered what he'd seen. Then he repeated the process on Talus. "What did you see, Master?" asked the female acolyte. "Who among our enemies could have bested Tovin?" "Something Faereyas hasn't seen in hundreds of years, Lara," replied Varric. He turned to again look upon his dead acolyte. "There is a new chosen in the world, my children." Thank you for listening. Be sure to like, share, and leave a 5-star review for the show. If you would like a copy of the Unscarred, please see the Amazon link in the show notes. Hardcover, paperback, and digital copies are all available right now. And if you want to email the show, hit me up at erictheunscarred@gmail.com.